What if the year was 1150? What if your life was not your own, but a mere reflection of the men around you? What if your very existence was defined by rules that seemed to mock fairness? Let us peel back the centuries and glimpse a world where the scales of justice tipped heavily against one half of humanity. Welcome to the perplexing realities of women's lives in the middle of the 12th century. Number 12, restricted property ownership and control. Imagine a world where the very ground beneath your feet, the walls around your home, and the tools of your livelihood were not truly yours, simply because you were a woman. In the year 1150, for countless women across Western Europe, this was not an abstract thought, but a harsh daily reality. The concept of independent property ownership for women, especially married women, was largely a distant dream, if it existed at all. Land was the ultimate currency of power, the foundation of wealth, and the guarantor of social standing. It provided security, sustenance, and the means to wield influence. Yet for women, direct control over this most vital asset was systematically curtailed. Consider a woman named Isolde, a capable daughter of a prosperous landholder. Her brothers, younger though they might be, were destined to inherit the family estates, the sprawling fields, the buzzing mills, and the sturdy manor house. Isolde, despite her intelligence and understanding of the land, would receive a dowry, a sum of goods or money, or perhaps a small plot of land to be managed by her future husband. This dowry was intended to provide for her, to give her a secure place in her new household, but it did not grant her ownership or control. Once married, that dowry, legally speaking, often became the husband's property or was placed under his complete administration. He could mortgage it, sell it, or use it as collateral, often without his wife's explicit consent or even her knowledge. This legal disposition meant that even if a woman brought substantial wealth into a marriage, she lost immediate agency over it. Her economic identity was subsumed by her husband's. She could not, for instance, independently purchase additional land, invest in a new venture, or even sell a small parcel to generate income in times of need. Any major transaction involving property that nominally belonged to her through inheritance or dowry would require her husband's signature, his permission, or his oversight. This created an immense dependency, binding her economic fate inextricably to her husband's decisions, good or ill. Even for unmarried women, such as spinsters or widows, while they might have enjoyed slightly more latitude, it was still often a conditional freedom. A widow, for example, might inherit a portion of her deceased husband's land to support herself and her children, a concept known as dower. This dower land was hers to use for life, but she typically could not sell it or pass it onto her own heirs independently. Upon her death, it would revert to her husband's family or his designated heirs. If she remarried, her new husband would gain control of her dower property, perpetuating the cycle of male guardianship. The legal frameworks of the time, heavily influenced by feudal custom and nascent common law, viewed land as a masculine domain, essential for military service, political power, and the maintenance of lineage. A woman, by virtue of her perceived role as a homemaker and mother, was seen as incapable or unsuited for the burdens of land management and defense. This was, of course, a sweeping generalization that ignored the countless women who effectively managed estates in their husbands' absences or during their widowhood, but the law rarely bent to individual capability. Consider the practical implications. If a woman's family fell on hard times, perhaps due to a poor harvest or a protracted war, and she had inherited personal wealth from a relative, she could not simply use that wealth to alleviate the distress of her household directly. Her husband would be the one to decide how to deploy those resources, and his decisions might not always align with her wishes or the family's best interests. This lack of control extended to all significant assets, from livestock to valuable tools and even large sums of money. This law was not just a legal technicality, it was a societal blueprint that dictated who held power and who did not. It ensured that women remained economically reliant, a condition that curtailed their autonomy in almost every other aspect of life. Without the independent means to support themselves, to initiate new ventures, or to make significant financial decisions, women were largely confined to roles dictated by their male guardians, whether fathers, brothers, or husbands. It was a constraint that permeated every level of society, from the highest noblewoman to the lowliest peasant, limiting their aspirations and reinforcing a hierarchy where women occupied a definitively subordinate economic position. The inability to fully own and control property was a fundamental barrier to their independence, a persistent unfairness woven into the very structure of their world. Number 11. Unequal inheritance rights. Picture this: your family's legacy, the very essence of generations of toil and triumph, stands before you. Because of your gender, your claim to it is weaker, perhaps even non-existent compared to your brother's, even if he is years younger than you. This was the stark reality of unequal inheritance rights for women in 1150. Across much of medieval Europe, the principle of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the bulk, if not all, of the family's land, titles, and wealth, was firmly entrenched. This was not merely a custom. It was a foundational legal principle that shaped destinies and cemented social hierarchies. Primary justification for primogeniture was the preservation of family estates and titles, particularly in the feudal system, where landholding was intrinsically linked to military service and political power. It was argued that dividing land among multiple heirs would weaken the estate, diminish its military capacity, and potentially lead to internal squabbles that destabilized the social order. Therefore, it was deemed essential to pass the entire patrimony, or at least the vast majority of it, intact to a single male heir, typically the firstborn son. Daughters, this meant their inheritance was often reduced to a dowry, a sum of money, goods, or sometimes a small portion of land, intended to make them an attractive prospect in the marriage market. This dowry was not an equal share of the family's wealth. It was more akin to payment for their entry into another family, a means to secure a suitable match rather than an independent claim to their birthright. Daughter's future was thus heavily tied to her marriage prospects, and her financial security was outsourced to her future husband's family rather than remaining with her own. Consider a noble family with several children. The eldest son would inherit the castle, the vast lands, and the family name, along with all the responsibilities and privileges that came with it. His sisters, however, might receive only a dowry, a sum that, while perhaps substantial, was fixed and often a mere fraction of the family's true wealth. This disparity meant that a woman, regardless of her intelligence, administrative skill, or devotion to her family, could not expect to continue the family line or manage its estates in the way a son could. Her value was often assessed by the size of her dowry and her ability to produce male heirs for her husband's lineage, rather than her inherent worth or capabilities. What happened to daughters who did not marry or whose dowries were insufficient? They faced a precarious future. Without a husband to provide for them, their options were severely limited. They might remain as dependents in their brothers' households, often in a subservient role, or, for noblewomen, be sent to convents. While some convents offered intellectual and spiritual fulfillment, for many, it was a practical solution to avoid the economic burden of an unmarried daughter, rather than a genuine calling. Family avoided the cost of a dowry, and the daughter's care was provided for, albeit within the confines of a religious institution. This unequal inheritance system had profound ripple effects. It meant that wealth and power largely remained concentrated in the hands of men. It reinforced the idea that women's primary role was domestic and reproductive, not economic or political. Even in regions where women might inherit land in the absence of male heirs, such as in certain parts of France, or where custom allowed for partible inheritance among all children, the male line was almost always preferred. If a daughter did inherit, it was often with the implicit expectation that her husband would take over the management of the property, or that she would quickly marry to secure a male protector. Think of a widow who had managed her deceased husband's lands with shrewdness and success. When her own son came of age, even if he possessed less experience or wisdom, the land would pass to him. Her authority would diminish, reverting to an advisory role if that. The law prioritized male continuity above all else, even if it meant sidelining capable women. The very structure of society was built upon this principle, making it immensely difficult for women to accumulate independent wealth or power across generations. It was a legal framework that perpetuated a gendered hierarchy, ensuring that the legacy of a family, its name, and its land remained firmly within the grasp of its sons. Number 10. Lack of legal standing and testimony rights. Imagine being wronged, perhaps grievously, but having no voice to seek justice, no legal standing to bring a complaint, and no real expectation that your words would be believed in a court of law. This was the silent burden carried by women in 1150, due to their pervasive lack of legal standing and diminished testimony rights. In a system dominated by male authority, women were often considered legally dependent, requiring a male guardian, a father, husband, or brother, to represent them in almost any formal legal proceeding. This meant that if a woman wished to sue someone, perhaps for breach of contract, defamation, or even physical assault, she could not do so on her own behalf. She needed her male guardian to initiate the action, to present the arguments, and to stand as her legal representative. This put her in a precarious position. What if her guardian was unwilling to take up her cause? What if he was colluding with the opposing party? What if he simply did not believe her, or did not deem her complaint worthy of his time and effort? Without his endorsement, her grievances often went unheard, her path to justice effectively blocked. Consider the case of a woman whose property was stolen or whose rights were otherwise infringed upon. She could not simply walk into the local court or before the Lord's Reeve and present her case. Her husband or father would have to be the one to speak for her, to plead her cause, and to engage in the intricate legal dance of the day. If he failed to do so, or if he was absent or deceased, her ability to seek redress evaporated. This legal dependency was a profound limitation, reducing her to a passive recipient of justice, rather than an active participant in its pursuit. Furthermore, a woman's testimony in court was often treated with suspicion or given less weight than a man's, particularly in criminal cases or those involving accusations against men. This was rooted in prevailing societal attitudes that questioned women's rationality, emotional stability, and susceptibility to deception. While men might swear oaths on holy relics or Bibles, a woman's oath might be deemed less credible, requiring corroboration from a male witness or being dismissed entirely. This put women at a severe disadvantage when they were victims of crime, making it incredibly difficult for them to secure convictions against their aggressors. Imagine a woman who had witnessed a crime, perhaps a violent theft or even a murder. Her account, no matter how precise or compelling, might be considered secondary to that of a man, simply by virtue of her gender. The legal system, shaped by centuries of patriarchal thought, implicitly or explicitly viewed women as less reliable narrators of truth in formal settings. This systemic doubt undermined their ability to contribute to legal proceedings and, by extension, to the administration of justice itself. This disparity was not merely theoretical. It had tangible, often devastating, consequences for women's safety and well-being. If a woman was the victim of assault or domestic violence, the path to justice was fraught with obstacles. She needed a male guardian to bring the complaint, and then her testimony might be questioned or dismissed. The very mechanisms designed to protect citizens often failed women, leaving them vulnerable and without effective legal recourse. Their inability to stand as independent legal agents meant that their voices were muted, their experiences devalued, and their pursuit of fairness often a lonely and unfulfilled quest. This lack of legal standing was a pervasive and profound unfairness, a daily reminder that women did not possess the same rights or recognition as men in the eyes of the law. Number 9. Forced or arranged marriages. Imagine your future decided not by your own heart or desires, but by the strategic calculations of your family, turning your life into a pawn in a larger game of alliances and land. In 1150, for countless women, marriage was not a choice but a preordained destiny, a pact sealed by others. Forced or arranged marriages were the norm, especially among the nobility and propertied classes, driven by economic necessity, social advancement, and political ambition. A woman's consent, while sometimes formally sought, was often a mere formality, carrying little weight against the overwhelming expectations and pressures of her family. The motivations behind these arrangements were powerful and deeply ingrained in the societal structure of the time. For noble families, marriage was a critical tool for consolidating land, forging alliances with other powerful families, securing peace, or ending feuds. Daughter became a valuable commodity, a living bond that could unite two houses, expand territories, or simply ensure the continuity of a lineage. Personal feelings were secondary, if considered at all, to the greater good of the family's standing and fortune. Consider a young woman, perhaps barely into her teens, who is told she is to marry a man she has never met, possibly significantly older than herself, and from a distant region. Family might have been negotiating this alliance for years, weighing the benefits of his land, his family's military strength, or their political influence. Her role was simply to accept, to submit to the will of her father or male guardian, and to fulfill her duty to her family. Refusal was not an option for most, and the consequences could be severe, ranging from social ostracism to disinheritance or even confinement to a convent. The psychological toll of such a union must have been immense. To be bound to a stranger, often for life, with no emotional connection, and with the primary expectation being the production of male heirs, was a profoundly alienating experience. Love, if it developed, was an unexpected bonus, not a prerequisite. The marriage was a contract, a transaction, with the woman as the primary collateral. Agency in choosing her life partner, arguably one of the most significant decisions a person makes, was entirely stripped away. Even for women of lower social standing, while marriages might have been less politically motivated, they were still often arranged by families to ensure economic stability or to combine resources. A peasant family might seek a bride or groom from a neighboring village to merge land plots, to gain an extra pair of hands for labor, or to strengthen community ties. While individual preferences might have played a slightly larger role at this level, the overriding factor was still practicality and survival, not romantic love or personal desire. The law, both customary and nascent written codes, largely upheld these arrangements. A marriage once formally agreed upon by the families and consecrated by the church was binding. The woman's earlier lack of consent, if it could even be proven, was rarely grounds for annulment once the union was consummated. Her status became irrevocably linked to her husband's, and her identity subsumed within his household. She transitioned from being her father's daughter to her husband's wife, with little opportunity to shape her own destiny in between. This fundamental lack of choice was a persistent unfairness. It meant that a woman's life path was often predetermined before she could even articulate her own desires or aspirations. Her body, her future, and her children were often treated as assets to be strategically deployed for the benefit of the male line of her family. It was a system that valued lineage and property above individual happiness and autonomy, and in this equation, women were consistently on the side of the ledger marked objects of exchange, not agents of choice. Number 8. Husband's legal authority over wife and children. Imagine a life where your husband holds almost absolute power over your very person, your decisions, and even the fate of your children, with little to no legal recourse for you to challenge his will. This was the stark reality for women in 1150, where the husband's legal authority over his wife and children was largely unchallenged, rooted in custom, religious doctrine, and emerging legal principles. The concept of marital power meant that a wife was, in many significant ways, subservient to her husband, considered legally dependent on him. This authority encompassed nearly every aspect of a woman's life. A husband had the right to manage her property, to control her movements, and to act as her legal representative. He could make decisions regarding their children's education, their future marriages, and even their religious upbringing, often without needing his wife's consent or even consultation. His word was typically law within the domestic sphere, and his decisions were legally binding. Consider a woman, say a leaner, who strongly believed her eldest son should pursue a life in the church, believing it would bring him honor and salvation. Her husband, however, might insist on training the boy for knighthood, seeing it as a path to greater family power and prestige. Despite Alina's heartfelt pleas and reasoned arguments, her husband's decision would legally prevail. She had no independent standing to challenge his authority in such matters. This meant that even in matters as deeply personal as the upbringing of her own children, her will could be overridden. Furthermore, the husband's authority often extended to the realm of discipline. While the specifics varied by region and social class, the legal framework of the time often allowed a husband to physically punish his wife, usually within certain ill-defined limits, for perceived disobedience or misconduct. While extreme violence was often condemned, moderate chastisement was viewed as a husband's right and duty to maintain order within his household. For a woman, this meant that escape from an abusive situation was incredibly difficult, if not impossible. There were few, if any, legal avenues for her to seek protection or separate from her husband based on cruelty, particularly if the violence was not life-threatening. Public authorities rarely intervened in domestic disputes unless they escalated to murder or extreme public scandal. The lack of recourse for women in such situations was a profound unfairness. A wife could be subjected to arbitrary decisions, financial mismanagement, or even physical abuse by her husband, with little legal protection. Her identity was, in a legal sense, subsumed by his. She could not own property independently, sign contracts, or represent herself in court without his consent. This concept, sometimes referred to as a nascent form of coverture, essentially meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal persona merged with her husband's, making her legally invisible as an independent entity. This overarching authority also meant that a husband could control his wife's interactions outside the home. He could restrict her visits to friends or family, dictate her public appearances, or even forbid her from engaging in certain activities, regardless of her desires or practical needs. Her sphere of influence was largely confined to the household, and even there, her ultimate authority was often secondary to his. The system was designed to maintain order, secure property, and ensure the continuation of the male lineage, but it did so at the expense of women's autonomy and well-being. It reinforced the idea that women were perpetual minors, always requiring the protection and guidance of a male guardian. This pervasive legal authority of the husband over his wife and children was a fundamental pillar of medieval society, an unfairness that permeated every layer of a woman's life, denying her control over her own body, her resources, and her most cherished relationships. Number 7. Limited access to education and public life. Imagine a world where knowledge is a guarded treasure, its gates largely closed to you simply because you are a woman. In 1150, access to formal education and meaningful participation in public life was severely restricted for women across all social strata. While men were groomed for roles in the church, law, military, or commerce through formal schooling or apprenticeships, women's learning was predominantly practical, focused on domestic skills, and almost entirely confined to the private sphere. For most women, education meant learning household management, spinning, weaving, cooking, child-rearing, and basic religious instruction. A noblewoman might learn to read and write, often in Latin, but this was primarily to manage household accounts, oversee servants, or engage in religious devotions. It was rarely intended to prepare her for intellectual pursuits, legal arguments, or political discourse. Her literacy was a tool for domestic efficiency, not a pathway to public influence. Consider a gifted young woman, perhaps with a keen mind for numbers or a talent for strategic thinking. Her male contemporaries would be sent to monastic schools, cathedral schools, or later, nascent universities, where they would study theology, law, medicine, or the liberal arts. They would learn rhetoric, debate, and the intricacies of governance. She, however, would be expected to master the art of running a large household, overseeing the pantry, directing the servants, and ensuring the smooth functioning of her husband's estate. While these were vital skills, they offered no pathway to wider societal participation or recognition beyond the domestic realm. This confinement to the domestic sphere meant that women were largely excluded from the burgeoning public life of the medieval period. They could not typically serve as judges, lawyers, scribes, or hold positions in government or the church hierarchy. They were not part of the councils of nobles, the assemblies of towns, or the military campaigns that shaped the political landscape. Their voices were absent from the debates and decisions that governed their lives and communities. Even in economic life, where women often played crucial roles in family enterprises, their public visibility and independent agency were limited. While women might assist in markets, run small shops, or practice midwifery, they were generally excluded from powerful guilds and professions that required extensive training and offered paths to wealth and influence. A woman could be a skilled brewer, but she would struggle to gain the same recognition or autonomy as a male master brewer in a guild. Justifications for this exclusion were deeply rooted in societal beliefs about women's nature. Women were often perceived as inherently less rational, more emotional, and less suited for intellectual rigor or the pressures of public life. Primary purpose was seen as reproductive and domestic, ensuring the continuation of the family and the smooth running of the home. Education beyond what was necessary for these roles was deemed superfluous, even potentially dangerous, as it might divert them from their natural duties. This limited access to education and exclusion from public life was a profound unfairness because it denied women the opportunity to fully develop their intellectual capacities, to contribute their talents to wider society and to participate in shaping their own destinies. It meant that their potential was often stifled, their voices unheard, and their influence curtailed. Gates of power, knowledge, and public discourse remained largely shut, creating a systemic barrier that reinforced their subordinate status and limited their horizons to the confines of home and family. It was a silent form of disenfranchisement, ensuring that the male perspective dominated every sphere of medieval life. Number 6, strict sexual morality and unequal adultery laws. Imagine living in a world where your very honor, your family's reputation, and your future hinged precariously on your sexual purity, while a man's similar transgressions were often overlooked or met with far lesser consequences. In 1150, strict sexual morality, particularly for women, was a cornerstone of societal order, reinforced by deeply unequal adultery laws. A woman's adultery was not just a moral failing, it was a profound social and legal transgression, often leading to devastating consequences, while a man's similar actions rarely incurred comparable penalties. The intense focus on female chastity stemmed from several interconnected beliefs. First, purity was intrinsically linked to a woman's honor, and by extension, the honor of her family. A virtuous woman brought prestige to her lineage, while a fallen woman brought shame. Second, and perhaps more importantly, female fidelity was crucial for ensuring the legitimacy of heirs. In a patriarchal society, where lineage and property passed through the male line, any doubt about a child's paternity could undermine inheritance claims and destabilize the social order. A woman's adultery, therefore, was seen as a threat to the very fabric of male succession and family wealth. Consider a woman, Agnes, who was discovered to have committed adultery. The consequences could be catastrophic. She might be publicly shamed, perhaps forced to wear a mark of her transgression, or driven from her home and family. Her husband might divorce her, often with the right to keep her dowry and any children she had borne. In some regions or under severe circumstances, she could face corporal punishment, imprisonment, or even death, though the latter was less common in 1150 than in earlier or later periods. The shame would cling to her, making it nearly impossible to remarry honorably or reclaim her place in society. Her social standing would be utterly ruined, leaving her destitute and isolated. Contrast this with a man's adultery. While condemned by the church, male infidelity was often treated with far more leniency by secular law and society. A husband's sexual liaisons outside of marriage, particularly with women of lower social status, were frequently tolerated, especially if they did not result in illegitimate children who might threaten the primary lineage. He would rarely face public shaming, legal penalties, or the loss of his property or social standing. His honor was not fundamentally compromised in the same way a woman's was. This glaring double standard created an environment of profound unfairness. Women were held to an impossibly high standard of purity, with severe repercussions for even perceived transgressions, while men largely operated under a different, more forgiving moral code. The burden of maintaining family honor and ensuring legitimate heirs fell squarely on the shoulders of women, and their bodies became sites of control and scrutiny. The law rarely provided any recourse for a woman whose husband was unfaithful, even if his actions brought shame or disease upon the household. She could not typically divorce him for adultery, nor would he face any significant legal penalty. Her duty was to endure, to remain loyal, and to preserve the domestic order, regardless of her husband's conduct. This unequal application of sexual morality was a powerful tool of social control, reinforcing women's subordinate status and limiting their autonomy. Policed their bodies, dictated their behavior, and ensured that their worth was intrinsically tied to their perceived purity. The severe and disproportionate penalties for female adultery served as a stark reminder of their precarious position, a constant threat that loomed over their lives, ensuring conformity to a rigid moral code that barely applied to the other half of the population. It was an unfairness woven into the very fabric of their social and legal existence, leaving women vulnerable and without true recourse. Number 5, restrictions on professions and trades. Imagine a world where your skills, your talents, and your ambitions hit an invisible wall simply because you were born a woman, limiting your economic opportunities to the fringes of society. In 1150, women faced significant restrictions on their participation in skilled professions and trades. largely excluded from the burgeoning guild systems that dominated urban economic life. While men could aspire to become master craftsmen, merchants, or professionals, women's work was typically confined to the domestic sphere or low-paying, unskilled labor, often as extensions of male-run enterprises. The rise of guilds during the High Middle Ages played a crucial role in regulating crafts and commerce, establishing standards, training apprentices, and protecting the interests of their members. However, these guilds were overwhelmingly male-dominated. Entry was usually through a lengthy apprenticeship, followed by a journeyman period, and finally, the presentation of a masterpiece to gain full membership as a master. These paths were largely closed to women, denying them formal training, recognition, and the economic benefits that came with guild membership, such as regulated wages, quality control, and collective bargaining power. Consider a young woman, perhaps named Isolde, who had a natural talent for dyeing textiles or weaving intricate patterns. Her brother might enter an apprenticeship with a master dyer, learning the trade over many years, eventually becoming a master himself, opening his own workshop and training his own apprentices. Isolde, despite her skill, would likely work alongside her father or husband, perhaps contributing significantly to the family business, but without formal recognition as a master craftswoman. She might be paid less, have fewer rights, and certainly no voice in guild decisions or governance. While women were not entirely absent from economic life, their roles were often circumscribed. They frequently worked as assistants to their fathers or husbands in family businesses, such as bakeries, taverns, or workshops. They might manage household accounts, handle sales, or perform specific tasks within a larger enterprise. Some women ran small-scale businesses independently, such as alewives, midwives, or laundresses, but these were typically low status, less lucrative, and often lacked the formal structures and protections afforded to male-dominated trades. Justifications for excluding women from most skilled professions were varied. There was the belief that women were physically weaker or less capable of strenuous labor, despite evidence to the contrary in agricultural work. There was also the societal emphasis on women's primary role as wives and mothers, with their work seen as supplemental to their husband's income rather than an independent pursuit. Guilds themselves, often rooted in fraternal bonds and military-like structures, fostered an environment that explicitly excluded women from full membership and leadership. This restriction meant that women had limited avenues for economic independence and upward mobility. Their earning potential was capped, their skills often undervalued, and their ability to accumulate wealth independently was severely curtailed. If a woman was widowed and had no adult sons, she might try to continue her deceased husband's trade, but she would face significant challenges without guild membership or the social standing that came with it. She might be forced to sell the business or accept a much lower income. This systemic limitation on professions and trades was a profound unfairness because it denied women the opportunity to fully realize their economic potential and contribute to society in diverse ways. It funneled them into a narrow range of occupations, often those that were less respected and less remunerative, ensuring their continued economic dependence on male relatives. It was a silent yet powerful barrier that limited their aspirations and reinforced a gendered division of labor, ensuring that economic power and influence remained largely within the grasp of men. Number 4, dowry as marital property, not personal property. Imagine bringing a substantial gift, a carefully accumulated treasure meant to provide for your future, into your marriage, only for it to vanish from your control, becoming a tool for your husband's discretion. This was the common plight of women in 1150 concerning the dowry system. While a dowry was ostensibly brought by the woman or her family for her benefit and to secure her place in her new household, it legally became her husband's property or was managed entirely by him, often without her independent control or right to reclaim it. The dowry served multiple purposes in medieval society. For the woman's family, it was a means to secure a suitable marriage for their daughter, a demonstration of their wealth and status, and a payment to her new family for accepting her. For the husband's family, it represented an influx of wealth, land, or goods that could be used to enhance their own fortunes, expand their estates, or repay debts. For the woman herself, the dowry was meant to provide a measure of financial security within her new marriage, a means of support that distinguished her from a woman who came empty-handed. However, the legal reality of the dowry was often far less empowering for the woman. Once the marriage was consecrated, the dowry, whether in the form of land, money, jewelry, or household goods, was transferred to the husband. He gained full legal control over it, and it was considered part of his marital property. He could invest it, spend it, mortgage it, or use it for his own purposes, often without consulting his wife. While customary law might dictate that the dowry was meant to provide for the wife, this rarely translated into direct control by the wife herself. Consider a woman named Isabella, whose family provided her with a valuable dowry of fertile land and a significant sum of silver coins. She arrived at her husband's estate with this wealth, believing it would secure her comfort and status. However, soon after the marriage, her husband might decide to sell a portion of the land to pay off a gambling debt or invest the silver in a risky venture without her agreement. Isabella would have little to no legal recourse. The dowry, once hers in sentiment, was now legally his to command. What happened if the marriage ended? If the husband died, the dowry might be returned to the wife, or at least a portion of it, allowing her to support herself as a widow. However, if the marriage was annulled or if the wife was divorced, a rare occurrence, as we shall discuss, the return of the dowry was far from guaranteed. If the wife was deemed at fault for the annulment or divorce, she could lose her dowry entirely, leaving her destitute and without means of support. Even if she was not at fault, recovering the dowry could be a lengthy and challenging legal battle, often contingent on the goodwill of her former husband's family. This system created an inherent financial vulnerability for women. Their security was ultimately tied to the goodwill and financial prudence of their husbands. It meant that even when a woman brought substantial wealth into a marriage, she rarely retained independent control over it, cementing her economic dependence on her husband. Dowry, rather than being a tool of female empowerment, became a means of transferring wealth from one male household to another, with the woman serving as the conduit. This was a profound unfairness because it disempowered women financially, even when they came from wealthy families. It stripped them of independent economic agency and control over assets that were technically meant to provide for them. The dowry system, while seemingly a benefit, ultimately reinforced the legal and economic subordination of women, ensuring that financial power remained firmly in the hands of men and solidifying their position as dependents within their marital homes. It was a constant reminder that their economic worth was not their own, but a contribution to their husband's domain. Number 3, inability or difficulty of initiating divorce. Imagine being trapped in a marriage that brings you misery, perhaps even danger, with almost no legitimate pathway to escape, while your male counterpart holds considerably more power to dissolve the union. In 1150, for women, initiating a divorce or annulment was an arduous, often impossible, undertaking fraught with immense legal, social, and religious barriers, often leading to destitution and isolation. The Church, which held immense sway over marriage, largely viewed it as a sacred, indissoluble sacrament, making formal dissolution exceedingly difficult for anyone, but disproportionately so for women. Christian doctrine, particularly as espoused by the Roman Catholic Church, held that marriage was a lifelong covenant. What God has joined together, let no one separate. This theological stance meant that true divorce, as we understand it today, the complete dissolution of a valid marriage, was almost non-existent. What did exist were annulments, which declared that a marriage had never been valid in the first place, or separations, which allowed spouses to live apart but without the right to remarry. For women, even these limited options were largely out of reach. To obtain an annulment, a woman had to prove one of a very narrow set of grounds, such as consanguinity, being too closely related, affinity, being related by marriage, pre-existing vows to the church, or non-consummation due to impotence. Proving these claims was incredibly difficult and often required extensive legal proceedings within ecclesiastical courts, which were overwhelmingly male-dominated and notoriously slow. A woman seeking an annulment faced the daunting task of navigating complex legal procedures, finding witnesses willing to testify on her behalf, and confronting immense social stigma. Consider a woman named Genevieve, married to a man who proved to be impotent, preventing the consummation of their marriage and thus the production of heirs, a critical function of medieval marriage. While this was a valid ground for annulment, Genevieve would face immense challenges in proving it publicly. Such matters were deeply personal and humiliating to disclose. Even if successful, the process could take years, leaving her in a legal limbo, neither truly married nor truly free. Furthermore, cruelty, abuse, or adultery on the part of the husband were generally not sufficient grounds for a woman to initiate an annulment or even a separation. While the church might admonish a husband for extreme cruelty, it rarely granted a wife the right to leave him permanently. A man, by contrast, might have slightly more avenues, or at least less social censure, if he chose to separate from his wife or even attempt to have the marriage annulled on grounds such as her barrenness or refusal to consummate. His social standing made it easier to push through such a process. If a woman did manage to secure a separation, she faced severe economic consequences. She would likely lose her dowry. Unless specific provisions were made, she would have no claim to her husband's property, and she would almost certainly lose custody of her children. Without independent means or social support, she would be rendered destitute, forced to rely on charity, or perhaps enter a convent. Her social reputation would also be severely damaged, making her an outcast. This profound inability to escape a broken or abusive marriage was a pervasive unfairness. It meant that women were often trapped in intolerable situations, forced to endure hardship, neglect, or violence with little hope of legal redress. Their lack of independent legal standing, combined with the Church's rigid doctrine, cemented their vulnerability and limited their autonomy in one of the most fundamental relationships of their lives. The marital bond, while ideally sacred, became an inescapable prison for many women, highlighting a stark imbalance of power in the medieval legal system. Number 2, custody of children solely with the father. Imagine the unthinkable. Your marriage dissolves, and you are left heartbroken, not only by the loss of your partner, but by the agonizing certainty that your children will be taken from you, their future solely in the hands of their father. In 1150, in cases of separation, annulment, or the death of the mother, custody of children almost invariably resided with the father or his family, regardless of the mother's wishes, her demonstrated capability, or the children's best interests. This was a direct consequence of the patrilineal nature of medieval society, where children were primarily seen as extensions of the male lineage and property of the father. The legal and customary understanding was that children belonged to the father's family, especially sons, who were crucial for continuing the family name, inheriting land, and providing for the future. Daughters, too, were considered part of the father's household until marriage, at which point they transferred to their husband's lineage. The mother, while vital for bearing and nurturing children, was seen as a temporary vessel, whose connection to the children was secondary to the father's bloodline and legal authority. Consider a woman, say Christina, who had been married for years and had lovingly raised her children, dedicating her life to their well-being and education. Her marriage was annulled, perhaps due to a pre-existing impediment, or if her husband simply decided to separate, Christina would face the crushing reality that her children would remain with their father. She would likely be granted no visitation rights, no say in their upbringing, and no ongoing connection to them. Her role as a mother, so central to her identity, would be abruptly severed by legal decree. This principle meant that even if a woman was an exemplary mother, providing nurturing care and moral guidance, her claims to her children were legally inferior to her husband's. She chose to send them away for upbringing, to another family, or even to a monastic institution, she would have no legal power to object or intervene. Children were considered his assets, his future, and his responsibility, not a joint parental concern. This also applied in cases where the mother died. While less about separation, it highlights the same principle. Children would remain under the sole guardianship of the father, and if he passed away, under the guardianship of his male relatives, not the mother's family. Even if the mother had surviving parents or siblings who wished to care for the children, their claims would be secondary to the paternal line. Consequences of this law were profoundly heartbreaking for mothers. It meant that even in situations where a woman was the victim of an abusive husband, or where she was forced out of a marriage due to circumstances beyond her control, she suffered the additional torment of losing her children. Her maternal bond, so fundamental and powerful, was legally diminished to the point of irrelevance when it conflicted with the father's rights. There was no concept of best interests of the child, as we understand it today. The overriding concern was the preservation of the male lineage and its property. This overwhelming preference for the father's custody was a pervasive and devastating unfairness. It denied women their fundamental connection to their children, treating them as mere incubators rather than active and indispensable parents once legal ties to the husband were severed. It reinforced the notion that children were primarily the property of the male line, cementing the father's absolute authority and leaving mothers powerless and often without the most precious relationships of their lives. It was a silent tragedy that played out in countless lives, a constant reminder of the patriarchal control over family and lineage. Number 1. Legal identity subsumed by husband. Imagine losing your very name, your independent rights, and your ability to act as a recognized individual in the eyes of the law, simply by entering into a marriage. In 1150, for women, this was the deeply entrenched reality of legal identity subsumed by the husband, a principle that foreshadowed later concepts like coverture. Upon marriage, a woman's legal persona largely merged with her husband's. She effectively ceased to be an independent legal entity, unable to sign contracts, own significant property independently, or represent herself in court without her husband's direct involvement. This was arguably the most fundamental and pervasive unfairness applied to women in medieval society, underpinning many of the other limitations they faced. It meant that a woman's voice, her agency, and her legal standing were filtered through her husband's authority. He became her legal representative, her economic manager, and her guardian in almost all public and financial matters. She was legally covered by him, her identity absorbed into his. Consider a young woman, perhaps named Alara, who was about to marry. Before her marriage, she might have had some limited rights as an unmarried woman or femme sole, able to conduct small transactions, own some personal items, or even inherit certain types of property. However, the moment she uttered her vows, her legal status fundamentally transformed. She became a femme covert, her independent legal identity suspended. This meant that if Alara wanted to buy or sell land, even land she had inherited, she could not do so without her husband's consent and signature. If she wished to enter into a business agreement, he would need to be the one to sign the contract. Her earnings, if she worked outside the home, would legally belong to him. Any debts she incurred, even before marriage, became his responsibility. Similarly, if someone wronged her or breached an agreement with her, she could not sue them directly. Her husband would have to initiate the legal action on her behalf. The practical implications were profound. This legal subsumption meant that a married woman had virtually no independent economic or legal power. She could not initiate legal proceedings, make independent wills for her own property, beyond very limited personal items, or enter into financial agreements without her husband's explicit permission and participation. Financial destiny and legal protection were entirely dependent on his goodwill, his competence, and his willingness to act. What if her husband was financially irresponsible, or tyrannical, or simply absent? Her ability to protect her own interests or the interests of her children was severely curtailed. She could not, for instance, independently sell an asset to cover a family emergency if her husband was away or unwilling. She was reliant on his decisions for every significant financial and legal matter, often without any true avenue for challenge. This legal framework was deeply rooted in the patriarchal structure of medieval society, reinforced by both customary law and emerging legal texts, often drawing on Roman legal traditions and interpretations of biblical authority. Women were often deemed less rational, more emotional, and therefore in need of male guidance and protection. Marriage, in this view, was not a partnership of equals, but a hierarchical relationship where the husband held ultimate authority. This fundamental lack of independent legal identity was the bedrock of many other injustices faced by women in 1150. It ensured their economic dependency, curtailed their autonomy, and muted their voices in public life. It was a pervasive unfairness, a legal invisibility that stripped women of their individual agency and cemented their status as perpetual dependents, defining their lives not by their own merits or desires, but by their marital relationship to a man.